This week on The Sceptic.
America and American politics has just got serious. These people are going to reboot the American system of government.
I speak to Douglas Carswell, former UKIP MP and now the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, on what Donald Trump's US election victory means for America and Britain.
I think what the election really should tell people in Britain is not about America. It's about the need for them to set their minds free. Stop believing the smart, stupid people around you.
Will Jones, editor of the Daily Sceptic, on the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby.
He is the first Archbishop of Canterbury to resign due to a scandal. He didn't just know John Smythe, Church of England's most prolific abuser. He financially supported him, and in fact he didn't do anything until the Daily Telegraph and Channel 4 exposed the whole thing.
Eugyppius, the pseudonymous substacker, on the collapse of the German government.
The CDU has been working behind the scenes to clear the way for a coalition with the Greens now for months. They're going to continue all green climate policies. As far as migration, it's all outsourced to EU, of course. Yeah, it's not a very happy picture.
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined here in the studio by Michael Murphy, writer for the Daily Telegraph, who gives us an exclusive inside look at his new documentary with Outpost Studios, Guardians of Israel.
Israel is a deeply misunderstood country. It's often portrayed in Western media as a kind of peculiarly evil state. We wanted to address this gulf of international perceptions around Israel and what the actual Israelis are like, the men and women who live in the country and what they're fighting for, essentially.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. But first, a message from our sponsor. Have you ever wondered what happened to the legendary Chuck Norris? I recently saw a video he made, and I was shocked. More than 50 years after taking on Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon, he's now in his 80s and still kicking ass, working out and staying active. He says he's stronger, can work out longer, and even has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He says he still feels like he's in his 50s. He did this by making just one change. His wife even started doing this one thing too, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger, her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. So how did he do it? Well, Chuck made a special video that explains everything, which you can watch by going to chuckdefense.com/daily, or by clicking the link below this video. It could change the way you think about your health. Once again, that's chuckdefense.com/daily, and click on the link in the description below to watch the video now. You won't believe how simple it is. Just a reminder, the legendary Chuck Norris is a whopping 84 years old and yet has more energy than me. He discovered he could create dramatic changes to his health simply by focusing on 3 things that sabotage our bodies as we age. See how he did it by clicking the link in the description below, chuckdefense.com/daily. Hello and welcome to episode 19 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at The Daily Sceptic. Now, in the wake of the resounding victory of Donald Trump at the US presidential election last week, the tears of the smug liberal left have been enough to fill the Grand Canyon. Well, everyone enjoys a bit of schadenfreude, but now the question is, what will a Trump presidency mean for America, for Britain, and for the world? Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by a man who was arguably the first leak in the dam of our own populist revolt, Brexit, back in 2014, when he defected from the Conservative Party to UKIP and successfully won the subsequent by-election in his seat of Clacton. He's also the author of several books, including Progress versus Parasites, and he's now the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Welcome to The Sceptic, Douglas Carswell.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so of course, we're here to talk about the US presidential election, but of course, many of our readers will know you as the MP who defected to UKIP back in 2014. And of course, you've got your America sign behind you there. So I think let's just start with, what have you been doing since being an MP and how did you end up in America?
Well, I came to America for 2 reasons, both pull factors and push factors, if you like. To put it positively, I was drawn to America by pull factors. America is an outstanding country in terms of freedom and liberty. If like me, you believe that freedom and liberty are the motor of human progress, they are, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, the two things that have elevated our species from the swamp to the stars, then there's nowhere that compares to the United States. It's an exhilarating place to be if you believe, as I do, in freedom and liberty. I also happened to think, after 12 years in the House of Commons in Parliament, that I was sort of in the wrong place. I don't just mean on the wrong side of the Atlantic. I felt I was in the wrong place by being in elected politics, because so often as a member of Parliament, I found that when you're an elected official, you're very constrained by the so-called Overton window, the parameters of what is and what isn't acceptable to discuss. And I felt that actually I needed to move both to this side of the Atlantic, but also to move upstream from elected politics into the think tank world to try to shift the narrative of what is and isn't acceptable politically. And I feel that the United States really is in a league of its own. I mean, if America falls, if America becomes a sort of giant version of California or a sort of North American version of France, then the lights go out everywhere anyway. So I feel that the fight to defend and preserve American exceptionalism, which underpins human progress over the past 200 years, is vital. I'll be honest, though, I also felt slightly pushed over here. I mean, I spent 12 years as a libertarian, free market, conservative MP. And on the one issue that I would say British governments have got right over the past 30 years, Brexit, I was very much in politics to achieve that. I felt we sort of put the thumb screws on the British establishment, on David Cameron and all the rest of it. We eventually got them to do very begrudgingly and incompetently Brexit. We had to win votes several times to get them to do that. On pretty much every other issue of the day, I would say they've been hopelessly wrong on multiculturalism, on mass immigration, on energy policy, on the environment. And I just sort of felt I wasn't really getting anywhere with them. There's only a certain number of times you can be a member of a Conservative Party and feel let down by people who aren't fundamentally conservative. And I felt that, the sort of the clown show that the Conservative Party had become wasn't really somewhere I wanted to be around. I was rather sort of fed up of being described as maverick for wanting freedom and low taxes and small government. And I think the final straw for me was probably the lockdowns. I remember sitting under house arrest in my family home in Fulham, and there was this sort of hysterical mob of lunatics clapping for a socialized system of healthcare that wasn't actually functioning, that was making the taxpayer subservient to its needs rather than the other way around. And I think I could see what was coming. I thought this is a dysfunctional body politic and political system, and I didn't want my daughter to grow up in that sort of society where ordinary citizens applaud state bureaucracies. Cycling around London during lockdown, refusing to be told what to do by police and officials. I knew at the time that the reaction to lockdown was totally disproportionate, totally delusional. I didn't want my daughter to grow up in a country run by people like Matt Hancock and Michael Gove, so I left.
And so that libertarian politics obviously being quite at odds with a lot of our political culture over here at the moment. And of course, given that, a lot of the reaction to it on the night was pretty much aghast as the results were coming in. I mean, I stayed up through a decent amount of it, and it was quite funny really watching some of the Channel 4 coverage, which was just increasingly anguished with people like Emily Maitlis, in fact, going off in a strop at one point. And so, I mean, as you were watching it that night, what was your reaction? Were you surprised by this?
I wasn't certain which way it would go, and I don't think anyone was. And anyone who says they were certain, I don't think really understands how these things work. There couldn't have been certainty. But I was optimistic that we might get that result. I wrote a piece a couple of days before explaining why it was that tens of millions of good, decent Americans were likely to vote for Donald Trump. I wasn't that surprised. I was delighted, though, with the result. I think the reaction of the old establishment media to the result tells you more about the inadequacies of the mainstream media than it does about anything else. I mean, the fact that they couldn't see this coming is extraordinary. So much of the political narrative in Britain, even today with the internet, even today with Twitter having been set free, even today, so much of what people think, people allow themselves to believe the fairy tale narratives of a delusional elite run by smart, stupid people. And they're smart in the sense they're very good at getting into Oxbridge and sitting PPP exams, but they are profoundly foolish in a sort of Rory Stewart sense that, they can pontificate about politics and be proved fundamentally wrong multiple times. I think what the election really should tell people in Britain is not about America. It's about the need for them to set their minds free. Stop believing the smart, stupid people around you who tell you what to think and what opinions to have. Free yourself from those people.
So, and in terms of the implications for, American voters and what they think, this seems like quite a decisive rejection of that type of politics, that sort of snooty, oh, you mustn't vote for them, and if you do, you're a fascist, you're a deplorable, you're garbage, that type of politics.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think lots and lots of people I know who voted for Donald Trump enthusiastically don't particularly warm to him. They don't think he's the nicest person on the planet. They kind of understand that he can be a bit abrasive. But I think weirdly that's actually part of his appeal. People are fundamentally fed up with inflation. They feel poorer. Lots of Americans. This might seem slightly strange to people in the UK, given that Americans have vastly higher living standards than people on the other side of the Atlantic do. But nonetheless, they feel poorer than they were 1, 2, 3 years ago. And this is because of inflation, because of an insane monetary policy that has debased the value of the dollar in the local grocery store. That's the number one issue. The second issue, I think, is immigration. People just feel it's outrageous that people are allowed to turn up here and claim everything that an American has. People, I think, are fed up with uncontrolled mass immigration. And what I think has really sort of struck them is this idea that no one in Washington was taking these issues seriously. No one was doing anything about it. So the idea of sending a rather abrasive Donald Trump along to DC to shake things up and maybe try and do something about it, I think appealed. I'm not sure people particularly know in detail what Trump is going to do. I think some of the early signs are incredibly encouraging. I don't think they know from a policy point of view in detail what he might do, but they know he'll do something different. They know it won't just be more of the same that America's had for 30 years. And I think that's a big part of his appeal. On the Kamala Harris side, I think you had this rather sort of condescending campaign, which was focused on saying, orange man bad, orange man bad. Fundamentally, Americans aren't interested in what pop stars think about Donald Trump. They can figure out for themselves what Donald Trump is like. I think there are two factors that people haven't really picked up about the election worth dwelling on. One is Twitter. Twitter, now it's been set free and it's controlled by the opinions of people on Twitter rather than the algorithms of a small elite in San Francisco. Now that Twitter's free, you could see through the fairy tale narratives of the leftist establishment. And the really long-form podcast, what we're doing now, long-form podcast has really come into its own now. And it's really interesting how Trump leveraged that, as Americans would say. He went on, not just Joe Rogan, but Patrick Bet-David. He went big on long-form podcasts because that is where tens of millions of Americans, particularly in their 30s and their 40s, now go to form opinions about stuff. And the left hasn't really cottoned on to this. And I think actually that's one of the untold stories of this election, how Trump utilized long-form podcasts.
So in terms of what Trump will get done or otherwise, obviously back in 2016, one of the difficulties he faced was that in terms of the Republican Party, he sort of hadn't really cleared it out of many of the people he would see as his enemies within that party. And similarly, in terms of the Washington swamp, which he had pledged to drain, he kind of made heavy going of that, I think. And or maybe they made heavy going of it for him. But will this time be different?
Yeah. I mean, some of the guys I know in Team Trump say this quite openly, that they underestimated the difficulty of getting the administrative state to bend to their will. Part of it was straightforward insubordination. Part of it was simply that bureaucracies aren't responsive to the people at the top of them, a problem familiar to anyone who's observed the system of government in Britain over the past 30 or 40 years. Trump, I think, has worked out in his second term how to do things differently. And this is, in a weird way, why the sort of 4-year interregnum of Biden might actually be Trump's great advantage, because it's given him 4 years to figure out a lot of this stuff. Instead of just railing against woke, he's got a very coherent policy to change the accreditation system at universities in order to eliminate the politically correct agenda that has been mainstreamed by universities into American society over the past 30 or 40 years. He's got a clear plan to abolish the Department of Education and push power back to the states and ultimately into the hands of parents through school choice. So he's thought a lot of this through, and he seems to have found the people to help him do it. What was notable about his first term is the turbulence, how he would hire someone, get fed up with them, and there was all that sort of courtroom drama in Trump's court. I don't think you'll see that this time. I think you will see people he trusts, people who understand what he's trying to do, going out there and doing it. Now, the really interesting thing is he has not only a conservative mandate himself, he's got a conservative Senate and a conservative House. And he's got a great speaker in the House, Mike Johnson, who very much shares his agenda. I think we'll see a Senate, not perhaps with a big enough majority to overturn the filibuster, but that may be no bad thing. But you're nonetheless seeing the Republicans with a once in a generation, maybe once in 2 or 3 generation opportunity to bring in some fundamentally transformative policy. And I think it's really exciting. I don't think Trump is a natural libertarian the way I am, but I think if you believe in small government, free market conservatism, give him a chance. See what he does. I don't think Orange Man is going to be all bad. I think he's going to do some stuff that actually you in the UK will suddenly think, heck, why haven't we done this? Why after 14 years of conservative government, didn't we think of doing this to the accreditation system in the universities? Why did Michael Gove, when he was education minister, not give parents control over their share of local authority funding? I think there'll be lots of things Trump does that conservatives in Britain who've fundamentally failed dismally for 20 years can learn from. So don't go for the Rory Stewart Orange Man bad narrative. Watch what Trump actually does. I think he's going to reboot America and reboot America for the better.
And so in terms of that attempt to woo Trump, firstly, what role should Nigel Farage play in that? We know he's very close to Trump. And secondly, how difficult is it going to make it, the kinds of comments of people like David Lammy, who's said that previously on social media that Trump is, I think, a woman-hating neo-Nazi sociopath, a neo-Nazi sympathizing sociopath, and Labour's general antipathy towards him?
I mean, America and American politics has just got serious. These people are deadly, deadly serious. They're going to reboot the American system of government. Some might even say they're going to undo aspects of the American government since the New Deal. They're going to fundamentally change, I think, America's relationships with some of its allies so that it's a partnership rather than America underwriting European systems of welfare. Unfortunately, in Britain, we're run by clowns. Britain is not run by serious people. Britain is run by a series of student politician buffoons on both left and right. They're not serious. On the right, you've had a succession of glib newspaper columnists like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, obsessed by the new and the meretricious, fundamentally people without any depth. On the left, you've got student union politicians like David Lammy, who think that it's okay to make obnoxious comments about foreign leaders. Now, it's fine to make obnoxious comments about foreign leaders if you want to stay on the back benches, but to appoint somebody who's got a track record of being obnoxious to foreign leaders as a foreign secretary, I would say Lammy is a diversity hire. There's no way he would get the job if it wasn't for the requirements within Labour to promote minorities. But having a diversity hire as foreign secretary with a track record of being obnoxious and out of his depth is really not a smart move. Having said all of that, I'm not sure that actually it really makes sense to talk in terms of having Nigel as in a formal role. And I don't. Don't get me wrong. I'm a huge admirer of what Nigel's done. No one more pleased to see him elected to my old seat in Clacton than I was. But I just don't think it's right to expect a Labour government to appoint as an ambassador someone who's not part of the Labour tribe. That's asking for trouble. What Labour needs to do is look at some of the Blair era ministers that they had, grown-ups, relatively speaking, people who at the time of the Blair-Bush alliance understood the importance of the transatlantic relationships, people that, Starmer and co would feel comfortable with, but people who have credibility in Washington too. And I think they need to replace the current ambassador, and they need to appoint a foreign secretary who has that gravitas. There are plenty of sort of Blair era ministers who I think could do the job. We need one of them rather than the incumbent clown.
And so, turning to foreign policy now, one of the criticisms that's often made about Trump is that the claim he's essentially going to sell out Ukraine. But then at the same time, he will be encouraging Western European countries to up their defense spending to the 2% required by NATO, in fact. And so, will a Donald Trump White House make the world safer?
I don't really know. And I don't think anyone does really know. And I think that's probably one of the great strengths that Trump has. I don't think he can be read. I don't think if you are a enemy of the United States in Tehran or Beijing or Moscow, you really know what he's going to do. I think it's almost certain that you will see a very significant new investment in the United States military. My own local senator, who's a very great man, Roger Wicker, I think will be chairman of the Armed Forces Committee. He's already talked about a huge new investment in America's military capability. I think you will see something along those lines, although I suspect the procurement process will be reformed so America gets better bang for its buck. I'm just not sure what you will see in Ukraine and the Middle East. Now, there are some people who, I'm a huge supporter of Ukraine's drive for independence. But I was listening to J.D. Vance, who's often characterized as being pro-Moscow nonsense. I think J.D. Vance and Trump are against World War III. Yes, it's great that we support Ukraine to become independent, and the breakup of the old sort of Russian sphere of influence, analogous with the breakup of Yugoslavia. But the Russians, equivalent of Serbia this time, have nuclear weapons, and there's something I find remarkably glib about politicians in Britain who seem to suggest that we should give the green light for Ukraine to fire missiles into Russia proper. Have they thought through the true implications of that? I'm not sure even Ronald Reagan would have ever advocated for that. So I think what Trump probably wants with Ukraine is a little bit more caution than the sort of Boris Johnson position. Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. I think he will be very, very pro-Israel, and I think the Abraham's Accords could be back up and running, and that, of course, was really significant. It saw Arab countries led by Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states begin to work with Israel collaboratively. You could say the October 7th atrocity was an attempt by Iranian-backed groups to try to undermine that. So I think Trump could be good news for Israel, good news for peace in the Middle East, very bad news for Iran. But let's wait and see. I don't want to be guilty of doing the things I accuse others of being at the beginning of this discussion, and that is to just recycle the opinions of the smart, stupid class. Let's just wait and see who he appoints and see what he actually does. Judge him what he says on long-form podcasts, not what smart aleck TV presenters say about him.
And I'm conscious that we're coming up on time here, but you mentioned J.D. Vance there, and he's obviously a politician who is a bit different to Trump, but he's very much in his mold overall. And of course, one of the initial media narratives about Vance was that he was weird. That was the claim. But I think he's quite successfully disproven that in the campaign. He did very well on Joe Rogan, for instance, in a very, he could speak at length on complex issues there, very sort of personably and clearly. And he obviously also did very well in his vice presidential debate against Tim Walz. And so, I mean, how significant is this sort of new generation of politicians like J.D. Vance in cementing Trumpism in the Republican Party beyond Trump?
I mean, I'm as guilty of misjudging J.D. Vance as anyone. I had sort of seen the film, read the book. I kind of assumed that he was a bit, I didn't quite buy into this idea. I thought on social media he had sometimes been a little bit abrasive. He was pro-tariffs, big negative in my book. But then, like you, I listened to him in the debate. I listened to him on long form, and I thought, wow, I've misunderstood this guy because I've seen him through the prism of people who are trying to misrepresent him. He's actually pretty astute. And there's a whole bunch of people like J.D. Vance, actually. I think one of the things that will be different about the Trump administration this time is that in the first administration, you could almost say Trump was so let down by so many people within the Republican Party hierarchy and the people who did politics in D.C. who came to work for him. He ended up basically relying on his family. And in a republic, that's not a good idea. That's a kind of an imperial thing, not a Republican thing. What's different, I think, this time is that the circle of trust doesn't just include immediate family members. There are people like J.D. Vance, Rubio, people who he's bringing in, who he's got a good relationship with. And I think there's a lot of them around. So, watch this space. Look and see some of the appointments unveiled over the next, or I should say, not even nominations. These are suggestions as to who he might nominate. I think it'll be interesting. In the first Trump administration, of the 10,000 appointees he had to make, after 18 months, a significant number of them hadn't even been made. I think this will be very different. There will be a cadre of smart, capable people appointed very, very rapidly. And I think some of them really will be very, very capable. Vance is just one of them. But, I think unlike on previous occasions, the conservative movement in America will use the levers of power rather than just, do what Bush and co did, which is to hold office. I think it's going to be quite fascinating to watch.
Okay, well, Douglas Carswell, thanks very much for coming on.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has resigned following the storm after his mishandling of a child sex abuse scandal. Now, Conservatives will not miss the woke warrior cleric, it's fair to say, but will his replacement be worse? Well, to discuss his resignation and what it means for the Church of England, I'm very pleased to be joined by Will Jones, editor of the Daily Sceptic. Welcome to the Sceptic, Will.
Good to be here, Laurie.
Okay, so it's big news in the Church of England. As people will have heard, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has resigned. Now, there's a long backstory to this, but the most recent thing is the Make-In report, which really pointed the finger at Justin Welby over his failure to act on allegations of abuse that had been very long-standing by this man, John Smythe, who was associated with the C of E for a very long time. But just give us a little bit more backstory here, would you, Will, about what's been going on here, about this story, and where Welby really fits into it.
Yeah, so I'm sure that Conservatives and people of a right-wing disposition can think of lots of reasons why they might want Justin Welby to have resigned a long time ago. He's obviously known for his woke interventions, his left-wing politics, criticism of the Rwanda policy of the government, quite radical race initiatives, calling his church deeply institutionally racist, and pushing forward very radical net zero eco measures, net zero by 2030, the Church of England is going for. But any of those are not the reasons why he has resigned. I'm sure listeners could think of a whole host more as well. But the reason he's resigned, the reason he's had to resign, he really didn't want to, is because of this particular child abuse scandal, safeguarding scandal. He is not, I should stress, of course, personally accused of any kind of abuse or misconduct in respect of children, but specifically it's relating to his failure to notify, to inform, to make sure that action was taken against John Smythe, this serial prolific, in fact, the Church of England's most prolific abuser. John Smythe conducted sexually violent abuse against children and young people over the course of many decades in England up until 1982, and then he was whisked off to Africa as part of a cover-up by the people who uncovered his abuse in England, and where he tragically continued, or scandalously I should say, continued his abuse in Zimbabwe and in Africa. So where does Justin Welby fit in? Well, he fits in quite a lot in strange ways. He knew John Smythe back in the 1970s. He volunteered on the camps where John Smythe met the young people who he abused, although the abuse didn't take place at the camps. Welby was not aware of this at the time, and although it has come to light that he was tipped off in the early 1980s and possibly had a conversation in the late 1970s about how there might be something a bit iffy about this John Smythe character, but he was not, and he says he was not aware of any of this abuse going on at the time, but he did know him, and in fact he didn't just know him. John Smythe was a charismatic leader, and Justin Welby was obviously a bit of a, well, I don't know if he was a bit of a fan, but he was certainly supported him in the way that it was expected of a younger person contributing and going along to these camps. He financially supported him. In fact, he financially supported him even after he'd moved to Africa, clearly showing that he didn't seem to be aware of what was going on. And he also continued to send him a Christmas card throughout the period and into the 1980s. So he knew John Smythe. And it's murky what Welby might have known in the 1970s and the 1980s. Welby insists that he knew nothing of Smythe's abuse until 2013, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury. The Macon report agrees that Welby is unlikely, doesn't appear to have known anything about the scale of the abuse, but does say that it's unlikely, this is what the report says, that Welby was not completely unaware of there being something iffy about John Smythe. But Welby himself told the reviewers, the people who wrote the report, that whatever he was told before 2013, he did not arouse suspicions in him. He just thought that he was maybe being told that someone was difficult to get on with, that Smythe was difficult to get on with, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit murky what he knew before 2013. And to be honest, if that was the only thing that he was being criticised for, he probably wouldn't have quit today. But where the criticisms really land is what happened from 2013. Justin Welby, of course, now becoming Archbishop of Canterbury in 2013. He then gets informed fully of what John Smythe was up to, what was going on in the 1970s and in England, and then in the 1980s in Africa. And what happens then is that Justin Welby takes an interest in this case, as he should, and but the problem is he then doesn't take action to make sure that John Smythe is being properly investigated, prosecuted, that the proper action was being taken. Now, this again is a little confusing, I think it would be fair to say, because Justin Welby was being misadvised, I think it'd be safe to say, by people around him at the time. He insists, and it says in the report, the Macon report, that he was following the advice that he was given at every point, but by safeguarding advisors, by whoever, by the people around him. But basically what happened is his chaplain, someone called Joe Bailey Wells, was advised Welby that Smythe that the police had been informed about the misconduct, the abuse, and that the Diocese of Ely, which is the relevant diocese which was looking into this, and the Bishop of Ely, whose name has temporarily escaped me, Stephen Conway, perhaps. Stephen Conway, was. That they were taking the relevant action, that the police were involved and were investigating, and so he decided, and he was advised, in fact, that he should not take any further action at that point, that he should not tell the police, because the police had already been informed that he should not tell the Titus Trust, who ran the camps in England, that he should not get in touch with anyone in Africa, because that everything was being handled by the relevant people, by the police and by the diocese of Ely. And so, and the problem for Welby, so that's a very long story, and I apologise for that. Well done if you made it this far. But the problem for Welby is that it just wasn't true that the police were investigating at that point, and that the bishop, the diocese of Ely, and those who should have been taking action, the people he was assuming were taking action, it just wasn't true that they were taking the action that he was told they were taking. And the problem for Welby is that he didn't then follow it up. He was happy then just to leave it there. And so for 4 years, between 2013 and 2017, he didn't bother, nor did he ask his team or did his team on his behalf get in touch with anybody to find out what was happening, whether the relevant action was being taken. The problem here, of course, is this John Smythe, I should say, died in 2018 of a heart attack. But at the time that this was happening, 2013 to 2017, he was still alive and therefore possibly carrying on his abuse. And so there was this problem that the Justin Welby did not do anything in this 4-year period. And in fact, he didn't do anything until the Daily Telegraph and Channel 4 undertook an investigation and blew it open, exposed the whole thing, exposed the abuse, got Justin Welby in front of the camera, asked him what on earth was going on with this. And at that point, finally, because he was forced to, because it was brought into the public domain, his memory appears to have been jogged, and he has then said that he will, all the usual things. He will do meet the victims. He will make sure all the relevant action is taken. He then jumped into action, although actually it's part of the criticism of him is that he then didn't really jump into action, because then after 2017 it was another further 4 years, 2021, before he actually did what he said he was going to do at that point to the television cameras and met with the victims. So we then have this huge delay of 8 years between him finding out about it and actually meeting the victims, and it looks like he only did anything or said anything because he was made to. Now you could say that he just was absent-minded, very busy man, of course, running the Church of England, and maybe he just didn't think about it. He'd been misadvised, whatever. All these excuses. Clearly, he thought that, which is why, although he apologised for not taking further action, he was very keen to stress, as you'd imagine, that he followed all of the procedures and processes and all the advice that he was given, that he did everything that he was supposed to do, and indeed that isn't actually contradicted by the report, and so he thought that he was safe, which is why he had refused to resign until today. Even as early as recently as yesterday, he was refusing to resign, saying that actually he'd done everything he was supposed to do. But the difficulty, of course, is that he didn't do everything he could have done, and of course he's forgotten, if you like, that he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, that he had a personal connection with this abuser, the most prolific abuser in the Church of England's history, and indeed also that other clergy, other bishops, had been suspended and forced out of their jobs effectively over exactly this kind of thing at his behest. So it's quite a lengthy backstory, quite complicated, but it gets us to where we are today. That in the end, he lost the confidence of the clergy. We had bishops calling for his resignation publicly, completely unprecedented. I should actually say it's completely unprecedented for an Archbishop of Canterbury to resign. He is the first Archbishop of Canterbury to resign due to a scandal. His predecessor, Rowan Williams, resigned in 2012. But really that was stepping down because he'd had enough, basically. Went off to have a cushy job in leading an Oxford college. He's the first Archbishop of Canterbury to resign due to a scandal. And there were bishops calling for his resignation. Privately, there were many people saying that he should resign. And there was a petition that had been launched on Saturday, which had already accumulated over 12,000 signatures, all calling for resignations, and the newspapers were full of clergy and columnists, journalists, and public figures calling for his resignation. And this morning, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister himself, although he didn't call for his resignation, he went as far as he really realistically could as the Prime Minister by saying that the victims had been really, really let down.
Okay, thanks, Will, for that extremely comprehensive backstory. But I suppose the one thing that you didn't go into too much detail there, I mean, quite understandably, was the actual nature and extent of the abuse, because, it really was quite horrific. But I mean, I think it's worth just going into that a little bit so we have a slight bit more understanding of what actually was happening.
Yeah, so John Smythe was a really nasty character. He was apparently a very charismatic person who people were drawn to, which unfortunately just gives him more power to carry out the abusive behaviour that he did. He abused, it's believed, up to 130 young people, largely, exclusively young boys, young men, teenagers they would get naked, they would take their clothes off. I believe that he would remove his clothes often as well. And although it was not directly sexual in the way that we might usually understand that term, there's clearly a heavy sexual element to that kind of behaviour. And then he would beat them. He would beat them with rods, with implements, till their bare bottoms bled. They would have to wear nappies. They would have blood dripping down their legs. And this was, and he did this, and he told the young people that this was something they should do in order to purge their sins, if you like. So there was a spiritual dimension to it as well. He used his spiritual authority to convince them that this is something that was a good thing to do, and which was just another horrific element to this abuse. And it carried on for decades, and he did it both in England, as I said, and then in Africa as well. There was one boy who he was charged with I can't remember if it's murder or manslaughter, but with the killing of, although that wasn't actually a successful prosecution, but there was definitely question marks about what happened to him.
I mean, absolutely horrifying. And so one of the things you mentioned earlier was that obviously Justin Welby has now resigned after all that pressure, but originally he was going to be trying to stay, right, which is unusual in a way. And, you'd think the usual course would just be to bite the bullet and say, yeah, I've done something wrong. I'm going to resign, right? And so, well, what was his initial reasoning for, thinking that he might be able to hang on? And then what was the straw that broke the camel's back in forcing him to resign?
Yeah, so he thought he could cling on because he'd been following the advice and the protocol, the safeguarding processes. He believed that he had done everything that he was told to do. He was very badly misadvised, to be perfectly honest, and that's not to exonerate him in any way. He should have taken more interest, and he should have made sure over those 4 years that something was going on. But he was badly misadvised. But that's why he thought, and that he having followed the processes, he thought he'd followed the letter of the law, and so he thought that he could ride it out. Also, he's been doing a lot with safeguarding. They've been in the church. They've been bringing in, and he's been spearheading reforms to safeguarding to improve the church's safeguarding, protection of young people, rooting out of abuse, etc. And so he probably felt, I would imagine, that he was doing good work that needed to be completed, taken forward, and obviously, I imagine also that he likes being Archbishop of Canterbury. I think I've always got the impression that he enjoys being the Archbishop of Canterbury and having that role that he has. And I don't think he would have been. He's 68, so he's carried on. He would have to retire in 2 years. That's the rule, but he was carrying on bear in mind, Rowan Williams quit being Archbishop of Canterbury when he was 62. So Justin has carried on. So he clearly wanted to ride it out and felt that he could do. He may also have wanted to not leave the Church of England in the lurch. It's not a great time for him to quit by any means. The Church of England is being rocked by numerous issues. And same-sex marriage is really splitting the church as the church pushes ahead with reforms there, and he's right at the centre of that. So he would probably also didn't want to leave the church in the lurch. So there's lots of reasons I think why he wanted to stay on, and probably thought it was right to stay on, and thought that he wasn't really that he wasn't really culpable. He'd done what was expected of him, but it doesn't look that way, and people and it's not just the way it looks. It's that he hadn't grasped the additional dimensions to this. That he personally knew the perpetrator, that he had connections with him, that he had appeared to have been warned about him way back in the 1970s, yet continued that personal connection. Seemed to have a lack of curiosity, a lack of concern about it. Seems to have been surprised by the abuse that he was told about in 2013, but then still didn't seem to take it as seriously and the proactive action that you would have expected. I imagine he would say that he didn't feel that his hands were tied. He felt that he was just doing what he was told to do, what he was advised to do, and that he was a busy man, and so was leaving it to the police, to the Ely diocese, whatever. Maybe that's how he would defend himself. I don't know, but that is what. But that is why I think he thought that he could ride it out and carry on.
Yeah, and so of course this will be a major blight on his legacy as Archbishop of Canterbury. But in terms of his legacy more broadly, obviously there's the fact that he's known as a woke warrior, which will not endear him to many people, many conservatives especially. And then there's also the fact that he was very proactive during COVID in closing down many of the churches, which a lot of people are also still quite sore about. I mean, what do you think his legacy will be?
Well, he's going to have a very mixed legacy, and I think it's going to depend who you speak to. If you speak to many of our listeners and Daily Sceptic readers, I imagine that they will have an almost uniformly negative view of Archbishop Justin because of his woke warriorism and pushing all of these agendas. He's obviously got all these left-wing political interventions, closing down of the churches. That was controversial. That was very, very controversial within the church, and certainly with lockdown skeptics who were not impressed at all with that. And also that had a catastrophic effect on the already catastrophically declining attendance, Anglican attendance, the Church of England, so which has declined and continued to decline considerably during his tenure. So there's a lot of negatives, especially for people of our political persuasion, but there is, but he will be seen to have a positive legacy, I think, by especially by if you take a different view on certain issues. He's if you like, for example, if you're a fan of net zero and eco stuff, he's been pushing that forward. If you're a fan of of so-called racial justice, he's really been pushing that forward. There's lots of ways that if you take a different view, then you might think that he's done some good things. But I think he's very much he's very much a Marmite archbishop. I think he's very much, and I think part of the problem was that he had people who really, really didn't like what he was doing and what he stood for, and so they were always wanting to dislodge him and replace him with someone who was more of their liking. Although whether the Church of England is capable of producing an Archbishop of Canterbury that's more to their liking is a moot point. But what really did for him was when the Liberals and those who would normally support all his agendas turned on him, which is what happened over the last week or so. You had the Save the Parish. There's the other whole dimension that he was criticised for signing up to managerialist waffle and undermining the place of the parish in the Church of England. This was a major campaign that was being waged against him and his agenda. And interestingly, Paula Venables, the disgraced Post Office former CEO, was at the heart of that agenda. He said in a foreword to a book that from a few years ago that she was a major inspiration for his thinking, and he was even trying to get her to be the Bishop of London in 2017. Paula Venables, of course, disgraced Over the Horizons scandal. So there's that whole dimension to it as well. So it's a very mixed legacy. You can see there's lots of places where he made missteps in the eyes of this group or that group, and in some cases in the eyes of every group. So I think by the time he'd got to this point, the number of his enemies, if you like, that's probably too strong a word, although maybe it isn't, had just got to too greater level. And of course, safeguarding these days is the great thing that will bring anyone down. If you get accused of mishandling safeguarding for a person in leadership at the moment in any organisation, but especially the church, then that's really poisonous.
Okay, Will Jones, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks, Laurie.
Now, Germany's squabbling traffic light coalition government under SPD Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been stuttering along, highly unpopular with the German public, for 3 years. Last week, just as Donald Trump was winning the election in the US, it finally collapsed. Now, why has that happened, and what does that mean for Germany? Well, here to answer that question today is Eugyppius, the pseudonymous commentator and author of Eugyppius, A Plague Chronicle, the Substack, and a returning guest to The Sceptic, and in fact the Daily Sceptic's unofficial Germany correspondent. So welcome back to The Sceptic, Eugyppius.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so the German government has collapsed. And tell us a bit about what happened there. And I suppose in particular, there's two things that you might want to remind our audience of. So there's the coalition government, the traffic light coalition. So, who's in that coalition and what's the kind of fissures there between them? And then the kind of mechanism by which it collapsed was the debt brake, which is this feature of German politics that, our readers may not necessarily be familiar with. So, just tell us about those and what happened there.
Right. So the so-called traffic light coalition was elected, made up of parties in the wake of our 2021 election, consists of 3 parties. Each one of them has a color. Together they make a traffic light. So red is Social Democrats, yellow are the sort of market liberal Free Democrats, and then green are, of course, the Green Party. And so together they are traffic light. After the elections, the Greens and the SPD really wanted to form a government themselves, but they didn't quite have a majority, a parliamentary majority, needed a third partner, and really the only party around that was willing to govern with them was the market liberal FDP, and they're always kind of the odd one out because SPD loves social entitlements. Social Democrats like to spend on welfare and everything. Greens have big, ambitious spending projects of energy transition, which involve a lot of environmental subsidies and also money for infinity windmills and so forth. But the only reason to vote for the Free Democrats, for the FDP, is you don't want to pay more taxes because they're fiscal conservatives. So they're a very bare bones party. The only reason you vote for them, no more taxes. So the question was, how are the 3 going to form a coalition? And they managed to sort of square the circle in that they wouldn't authorize any more credit. They would observe the limits of the debt brake we have since 2009 in our constitution. Debt is capped at 0.35% GDP, can't exceed this. So they would keep the debt brake. They would not take on new debt. Instead, they would use old credit authorizations, emergency credit authorizations from the Merkel era that were taken during COVID. So if you declare an emergency, you can evade the debt brake. So they would use this unspent credit authorization from the Merkel period on all of their social entitlement spending and all of their green industrial subsidies. That was the plan. And it was legally doubtful at the time, but they sort of went along with it for a couple of years. And then the CDU, because it was their credit authorizations achieved under Angela Merkel, they sued. They didn't like it. They took them to court, in the Constitutional Court in Carswell. And exactly a year ago, the judges declared this budgetary maneuvering to be unconstitutional. And from that moment on, the whole raison d'etre of the traffic light was destroyed. The parties no longer had any common purpose, and they couldn't spend any money. It was a dead coalition walking, and it's just amazing it lasted this long. What really did the government in was the just crushing unpopularity, they are the most unpopular government in the history of the post-war Federal Republic of Germany. There's never been a government more unpopular. And especially the FDP, the Free Democrats, have been almost, in fact, according to me, the long-term future of the party is very much in doubt. They've been almost totally destroyed by their association with the government. So they, used to be a smaller but long-standing party. They've been in Germany since 1949, since right after the founding of the republic. They're an old party, but they're polling it under 1% in a lot of East Germany. They can't make the 5% cutoff to get back into parliament when there's elections. Very doubtful they're going to have that much support. Their party could be, in the long term, could have been destroyed, actually. It's hard to know what will happen. So there was so much pressure on them to do something, especially after the East German elections, where they were kicked out of all 3 East German parliaments that had elections. I believe in Saxony they had 0.8% of the vote, or something really humiliating for a traditional party like this. So they announced this would be a fall of decisions where they would try to exact concessions from their coalition partners and try to please their base in some way. The Christian Lindner, who's the chief of the FDP and also finance secretary under the current government, submitted a sort of political manifesto for achieving an economic turnaround in Germany that was deliberately written. It's an 18-page document, deliberately written to demand concessions that his coalition partners could not make. Somebody leaked this document to the press, and I called it I said that its coalition's over with, and it collapsed within a week of that. Scholz, the chancellor, fired Lindner, his finance minister, and after that was all over with. Then we had this minority government and so forth. So
yeah, thanks. That was very comprehensive. And so the question now is, will there be an election? When will that be? And how has that been called, I suppose? And of course, there was a bit of a hesitation for a while over this question of would there be enough paper to send out the ballots, which seemed to be a bit of a strange one. I mean, so what's going on there, Eugyppius?
Yeah, it's been an absolute farce from beginning to end. So once a coalition partner leaves the government, it's not automatically dissolved. I'm not sure how other parliamentary systems work, but in Germany, they continue in theory as a minority government. They just can't do anything because they don't have any parliamentary votes. So the Greens and the SPD then became a de facto minority government without their liberal partners. And Chancellor Scholz would then have to either bring a confidence vote to the parliament and lose it to trigger elections, or the parliament would have to declare no confidence in Chancellor Scholz and by electing a replacement interim chancellor. That's how that works in the German Bundestag. And they couldn't do that, even though they had a majority of votes to oust Scholz. They wouldn't do that because they would have to violate the Cordon Sanitaire against Alternative für Deutschland. It would require AfD votes to achieve the majority to oust Scholz. So they couldn't do that. So Scholz was able just to sit in government and not leave, even though he was completely opposed by everyone and had no options. So he just refused for almost a week to leave and just sort of sat there like a total idiot. And nobody could do anything about it because they would need AfD votes to get rid of him. And he refused to bring a confidence vote for reasons that are mysterious, who knows. Finally, in the meantime, there were all kinds of weird... So he went with the electoral bureaucrats, the Wahlleiter, I'm not sure how you translate, but the people who run elections. There was some back dealing between Scholz and them, and then they came out and said, we don't have paper to hold elections. And then immediately representatives of the paper industry in Germany came out and said, actually, that's not true. We have actually a surplus of paper. And then Poland offered to give us paper as well, so we could hold elections. It's a whole fight. And then finally, just yesterday, enough pressure was brought to bear on him that he finally gave up. And so the confidence vote, I believe, is going to be held. Is it going to be this week, actually? And then there's going to be elections in February. So
right. And will that happen however the confidence vote goes? Or is it a foregone conclusion that he won't win it?
It's a foregone conclusion that they'll vote no confidence. So So then that will be the end of the government that triggers elections, and they scheduled them for end of February, 23rd February, I believe.
Right. Okay. And does that mean that's a dropping of the cordon sanitaire on the AFD, at least for that vote?
No, it works differently. So if it's very complicated, the cordon sanitaire has now become this. It used to be you could absolutely not achieve anything with AfD votes. If you did it, it was totally wrong. But now AfD is a little bit too strong for that to work. So now a constructive vote of no confidence to get rid of a chancellor under Bundestag procedure requires the simultaneous support of his replacement. So you can't just vote Scholz out. You have to vote in his replacement, who would be Friedrich Merz. So Friedrich Merz would then be electing himself into the chancellorship with AfD votes, which is a violation of the cordon sanitaire. If Scholz brings the confidence question, nobody has to be elected chancellor. He can just be voted no confidence, and then there are snap elections. So that's considered not a violation of the cordon sanitaire. Scholz brings the question. That's why it's okay in this way.
Right. Okay. So it wasn't a constructive no confidence vote, but of course the constructive thing that it did create was the election, which I think is now scheduled for the next spring. What do you think that will look like?
Well, it's pretty clear that the Christian Democrats and the Christian Socialist Party of Bavaria and the Christian Democrats, the Christian CDU, CSU are together going to become the dominant party, and that the chancellor will be Friedrich Merz, who is somewhat from the sort of market liberal wing of the CDU. So not quite a Merkel person, but CDU is still a very centrist party now, and Merz is not a conservative in any way. The big question is who they'll govern with, and there's two big unknowns. One is whether the Social Democrats will be strong enough to give the CDU and the CSU a majority all by themselves. So whether 33-34% CDU, where they're polling right now, plus 16% Social Democrats is quite enough for 51% of the seats or not. If they can't get a majority with the SPD, they'll have to have a third party in the coalition. And then the question is whether the Free Democrats are powerful enough or still have enough support to make it back into parliament. And I think they won't. I think it's very likely they don't make it back in which case the Greens will have to be the third partner. And so then we'll have the so-called Kenya coalition, which is like the present coalition, except that for the FDP is switched out and instead we have the CDU instead. But not a lot will change there. And in fact, it's important to note the CDU has been working behind the scenes to clear the way for a coalition with the Greens now for months, because they're counting in the same way I am and have realized this is necessary. So they're going to continue all green climate policies, just with more emphasis on carbon pricing. As far as migration, there's not really going to be much there. That's all outsourced to EU, of course. So it's not a very happy picture.
And so to be clear, the Kenya coalition is so named because it would be red, green and black, which is the flag of Kenya.
Right, the colors of the Kenya flag, of course, yes.
And so, but I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that kind of a coalition there? Because I mean, can you sort of illustrate to us what that would look like? Because it almost seems to me like it's the main centre-left party, the SPD, the main centre-right party, the Christian Democrats. And that would be almost like having the Labour and the Conservatives in this country forming a coalition together. I mean, isn't that a bit strange?
Now, this is very typical of Merkel-era politics. That's when we saw what was called the big coalition of CDU and SPD together. Because the CDU has drifted towards the center, if not center-left, over time. These are less contradictory parties than you might have imagined them to be. And there was sort of a signature Merkel style of politics to preemptively adopt leftist positions, to head off electoral attacks on the left flank. And so right now the parties are fairly compatible, I would say. The Christian Democrat parties, the conservative parties in Germany and on the continent in general have always sort of been open to social welfare programs and so forth. It's just a matter of how extreme you want to be in this direction. So the Social Democrats, there are some commonalities here. So it would really be a return of the Merkel era if they're able to govern by themselves. If you get the Greens back in, then it's just going to be exactly like the traffic light all over again. Slightly different emphasis and maybe a little better PR, but that's it.
And so, of course, we've just had this big populist revolt in America, voting for a party that's pledging to deport millions of illegal immigrants. And as you were telling me last time, part of what's been going on in German politics is that because of the successes of the AfD, especially in the recent regional elections, the Christian Democrats have been forced to shift to the right with their rhetoric, at least, and supposedly their policies on immigration. And what's happening now with that? Are the CDU sort of resiling from that position? Are they coming back to the centre?
No, they're not. Of course, they're going to at least hold on to this line through the elections, through February, because they're now in total campaign mode. They have to win. So they're continuing to adopt AfD talking points and behave kind of like an AfD anti-migration party. It's sort of odd. Even the Greens are sort of now talking about how migration is a problem and everything. So we've clearly... So in the context of elections anyway, German politics have become utterly transformed in a way that would have surprised somebody even 2 or 3 years ago. So that is progress. I think that even the rhetorical shifts are important, but exactly what comes out of this on a concrete level, is anyone have the political will here to pick a fight with the EU over asylum law and everything? I don't know about that. I'm very pessimistic about that, but they've at least conceded so much rhetorically that I think we are politically in a different place than we were undeniably, and that they can't really go back. So yeah, migration is bad. It's also interesting, the new narrative, of course, is that Putin is using migration as hybrid warfare to attack Germany and undermine the democratic consensus. So it's all linked up into this great big Putin figure of villainy. It's an interesting rhetorical development that Habeck had in his speech the other day. So yeah, I'm not sure concretely anything is going to change on migration front, but at least people are talking about it differently, and we no longer have to pretend the migrants are, a great resource and font of diversity.
I mean, if it's a form of hybrid warfare, then clearly it's not, a great boon to the country, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so in terms of the CDU and its policies here, I mean, it's interesting because as you've been saying, they've been trying to stake out a slightly more right-wing position on immigration, and the fact is that this Kenya coalition is really quite an unnatural coalition for them to be in. And so the question is, for me, is why don't they go and partner with the AfD, who they are obviously much closer to, and it would be a much more natural fit, you might think. But of course, they're maintaining that cordon sanitaire. But I suppose what's the reason behind them, continuing to do that? Why are they so desperate to keep it up, despite the fact that it might actually seem much better for their electoral calculus to go over and do a coalition with them?
Yeah, so it's interesting to study what are exactly the reasons for the cordon sanitaire. Why does it exist and whose interest does it serve? It's something you could write a whole book about, but just briefly, first we must remember that Merkel's triangulations over many years fundamentally changed the nature of the CDU. You could say that Merkel created the AfD herself via moving her own party to the left to sort of disarm green positions, asymmetric demobilization it's called. So she preemptively adopted green positions. She perceived they were an upcoming popular party. She tried to take those positions away from them by moving her party to the left, and in the process, she alienated the right wing of her party. Those people now are in the AfD, a lot of them are. So they left. That's what the AfD is. It's a bunch of former CDU people at root, and people whose views were once represented in the CDU and once part of the German political mainstream. They're now out extreme right-wingers in the AfD. So this has changed the nature of the CDU fundamentally, and the CDU no longer encompasses those views. So there is less ideological compatibility there than you might imagine. There's now among those people who remain in the CDU are a lot of people who appear to harbor genuine green sympathies, who really identify with green policies, really hope to achieve some kind of carbon neutrality, and they are very hostile to the AfD for this reason. Also, the AfD has drained out all of the Eurosceptics from the CDU. So now the CDU was a rabidly pro-European party, another thing that is a really sort of point of animosity between the two. The other point to mention is that the CDU understands that the AfD is an existential threat to them. One way or another, the AfD may well end up destroying the Christian Democrats. And the party, for this reason, especially the party leadership, absolutely hates the AfD. So if you look at who's trying to ban the party right now, it's led by a Bundestag representative named Marco van der Witz. He's a CDU politician. He lost his direct mandate to an AfD politician in 2021. You'll ask who's investigating the AfD and who's declaring them to be right-wing extreme and so forth. Most of this coming out of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which is our domestic spy agency, presently headed by a CDU politician, Thomas Haldenwang. Okay, so a lot of this, if you look at literature that's against the AfD, I've recently been reading all these anti-AfD books. Significant number of them are written by CDU politicians or people with connections to the CDU one way or another. So CDU is really kind of leading the fight here, trying to save themselves. Now, I could say within the CDU, there are sort of two schools of thought about how to deal with the AfD. So we're talking about backbenchers and ordinary people inside the party. There's been reporting on this. And one of the schools of thought is from the Merkel era, and it's that if they ever give an inch to the AfD or cooperate with them in any way, they will legitimize the AfD and immediately sign the death warrant for their own party, because all the people who support CDU positions will go over to the AfD, and that will be the end of the CDU. That was Merkel's line. That's why she absolutely believed nothing could be done with them. Otherwise, they would legitimize Alternative für Deutschland and, in a way, delegitimize their own party. The other view, especially prominent among backbenchers in the CDU, is that they absolutely have to find a way around the cordon sanitaire, because otherwise they will be forced always to cooperate with leftist parties and never be able to deliver on their core campaign messages. So there are these sort of two competing views within the party, and looking at some of the reporting on this issue, it seems like they have absolutely no plan about what to do. There's not really any strategy here. There's just the old Merkel school about shutting the AfD out, pretending they're not a problem, and then the school of thought that, we should actually cooperate with them, but there's otherwise no strategy, no plan, no ideas. It's very, very instructive.
Right, well, Eugyppius, as ever, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, as always.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.